This is the Comics Alternative Critical Takes, a conversation with Keith Dallas and John Wales. Hello and welcome to our inaugural episode of the Comics Alternative Critical Takes. I'm Derek, and on this episode I talk with Keith Dallas and John Wales about their new book, Comic Book Implosion, An Oral History of DC Comics circa 1978. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Critical Takes is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find unbeatable prices. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find incredible savings on a variety of comics for the month of August. And one of the best ways of getting your comics is in bundled form. DCB Service regularly offers bundles of comics from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. And you can get these bundles for anywhere from 45 to 50% off of the cover price. That's just one way of showing that you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. With this episode, we're starting a brand new series on the Comics Alternative, one we're calling Critical Takes. This will be an occasional series devoted to critical and scholarly works about comics. In the past, whenever we've talked with a comic scholar or historian on the show, we've included those in our interview series, one where we primarily focus on comics writers and artists. But we wanted to spin off our focus on critical works with its own series. After all, and as our tagline states, we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics. So it's only appropriate that we devote a series of episodes to the more theoretical, historical, and scholarly side of comic studies. Some of these shows, such as the one you're about to hear, will be interviews with authors of critical texts that enlighten our understanding of the medium. Others may be general discussions or reviews of critical or scholarly texts, like the histories we find from TwoMorrows Publishing or McFarland, or the kind of scholarly works coming out of the University Press of Mississippi, Rutgers University Press, or Bloomsbury Academic. Unlike our regular monthly series, but similar to what we do with our interviews, these Critical Takes episodes will be released on no set schedule, but just whenever we get them completed and can fit them into our ever-expanding schedule of episodes. And today we're going to start off our new Critical Takes series with a conversation with Keith Dallas and John Wales. They are the authors of a new book from TwoMorrows Publishing, Comic Book Implosion, An Oral History of DC Comics circa 1978. As the title suggests, this is an in-depth look at the events leading up to the DC implosion of June 1978, the build-up of the explosion that preceded it, and the effects and ramifications of the implosion, as well as its impact on what at the time was a highly flawed distribution system. What makes this text unique is its construction. This is an oral history, and John and Keith have excerpted a variety of first-hand accounts from interviews, news stories, and fan publications of the time, stories from the insiders who personally witnessed and were even victims of the DC implosion. These accounts are presented in such a way that they create a cohesive and compelling narrative of this moment in DC Comics history. I talk with Keith and John about the genesis of this project, some of the challenges they faced when doing their research, and their manner of chronicling comics history. This is a fascinating interview, and let's listen to that conversation now. I'm really happy to have on the Comics Alternative Keith Dallas and John Wells. They are the authors of a brand new book from TwoMorrows Publishing, Comic Book Implosion, an Oral History of DC Comics, circa 1978. John, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hey, Derek.
Glad to be here.
Now, for those listeners who may not be up on their comics history, and maybe some of our very young listeners who may not know much about specifically DC Comics history, could you describe what the DC implosion was all about?
John, you wanna tackle that one?
Basically, 40 years ago this summer, DC Comics was planning this expansion of their entire line. It was kind of an uncommon length. It was a 40-page comic book. At that point, comics were only 32, and of the 32 pages, you got 17 pages of story. And that was really becoming untenable. And the price was continuing to go up. We'd gone from like 20 cents to 25, 30 to 35 cents in just a span of like 4 years. So DC's idea, with Jeanette Kahn and Paul Levitz and Joe Orlando kind of at the head of it, was to actually expand to 25 pages of material rather than going to like a comic book with 17 pages of material for 40 cents. And instead, they were going to go to actually a 50-cent package that would have 40 pages, 25 pages of story. And they launched this creative process like in December of 77, getting the material ready. And with the idea that they would launch it in June of 1978 as a DC explosion. And they advertised it extensively for the several months leading up to that, released it. Fans were excited. And then in May of 1978, Warner Communications started looking at the numbers and said, no, you can't do this for reasons we'll get into. And basically told DC, you have to stop this immediately, stop the explosion, cancel books. And basically in September of 78, everything reverted back to the 32-page, 17-page format again, and now selling for 40 cents. And afterwards, because so many comics that had been advertised were canceled, people in the DC offices and then in fandom at large started referring to this as the DC implosion.
Because around 40% of their titles were cut in one fell swoop?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you guys point out very clearly in Comic Book Implosion is the fact that DC definitely wasn't the only publisher at that time who was cutting titles dramatically, that Marvel was going through the same thing, but they just didn't get the publicity, the negative publicity that DC got. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, that's a detail that generally doesn't get recorded in the history books, but several months after DC canceled everything, then Marvel started cutting books too. And there were almost a couple dozen titles that they canceled between November of 78 and the spring of 79 because they didn't advertise a big buildup of titles. They didn't get any notoriety.
Yeah, I think that's one of the misconceptions that we're trying to correct in our book, is that this was a singular DC failure when really it was what happened to DC was emblematic of the entire industry. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, it was both Charlton and Harvey that went to almost exclusively reprints?
Yes, Charlton went almost 100% reprint. Harvey was still doing some new material, but they were integrating reprint material with the new stories, and it was all timeless enough that you couldn't really tell what was what.
And so, I mean, I think we try to document that as much as possible, that, you know, Jeanette Kahn was really trying to correct a decade-long problem here, that she recognized the trend. I mean, sell-through rates were horrendous, and she was trying to make a comic book package that was both had value to the consumer and that was attractive to retailers, because retailers, you know, newsstand retailers were more interested, understandably, in selling copies of Time magazine and Newsweek and TV Guide and Sports Illustrated, because all those magazines cost $1, and they were getting more money for every copy they sold than they were selling the 35-cent, 40-cent comic book, which, let's face it, weren't selling nearly as many copies as Sports Illustrated.
Mm-hmm.
So she was really trying to correct. She at one point, what was it, John? Was it 1977 or even 1976, where, soon after Jeanette, came in, where she said, wait a minute, our comic books are too cheap. This is the problem. It's,
yes.
The comic book mentality has gotten it backwards, that we've been ever since, the 50s and late 40s, we've been trying to keep comic books cheap when we should have been keeping pace with the magazines and making them more and more expensive and incentivizing the newsstand dealers to keep selling us. And that's, go ahead.
Oh, that was something that Mike Gold, that was DC's public relations director during those years, that was really emphatic about in interviews at the time, that basically when comic books started, color comic books started in the 50s or in the 30s, you had a 64-page package for a dime, and in order to keep it at a dime, publishers went to 32 pages in the 50s. And what Mike Gold pointed out correctly was that never should have happened. That instead of cutting the price, they should have raised the price to keep a substantial package for retailers. And so that was one of the reasons why in 1976, after Jeanette Kahn got there, that she tried, her first experiment was the dollar comic line, which was basically to return to a package that was thick and had value both to a consumer and to a retailer. And the dollar comics project actually was tremendously successful. And that was kind of one of the things that helped push DC toward doing the DC Explosion next, because they were hoping that a thicker package would also sell to retailers and consumers.
And when we say, I think we should, I'm sorry, Derek, I mean, we should probably point out right now for your listeners that when John and I, at this point, when John and I say retailers, we're talking about like the 7-Eleven, we're talking about the stationery stores, we're talking about the newsstand dealers. We're not talking about comic shop retailers. I mean, they were really, correct, at this point in the mid-'70s, boy, there were probably maybe 100 comic book stores in the world. So we're talking about the newsstand distribution, which is a completely different operation than the comic shop distribution system.
Yeah, I mean, these are the places that I was getting my comics when I was a kid, at the 7-Eleven that used to be right down the street, at little general stores, at mom and pop drugstores, sometimes grocery stores. Yeah, I didn't even know comic shops existed when I was a kid in the 70s.
Me neither.
Yeah.
Me neither. I mean, I think my first experience with a direct market retailer was 1983. When one opened in an adjacent town, and my friends and I would ride our bikes to it. But otherwise, we would, up to that point, we would ride our bikes to the 7-Eleven. And if 7-Eleven didn't have the titles we were looking for, there was a stationery store a half mile up the road. So if one didn't have it, the other one did. But I can tell you, I don't know if I ever told you this, John Wells, that I mean, I don't ever remember seeing a Charlton comic book on the newsstand when I was a kid growing up, ever.
Wow. It
was all DC, Marvel, and Harvey. No Western, no Gold Key, no Charlton. I think I only saw Atlas comic books at like those used bookstores that would have like a section devoted to like back issue comics. That was the first time I ever saw an Atlas comic book. But in my neighborhood, the newsstand dealers only had Harvey, Marvel, and DC.
Wow. Now, I apparently was pretty lucky here in Southeast Iowa. So we had everything. at all the little news. In fact, I remember the Atlas comics. I had no idea they were coming because I think I would have been about 10 years old when the first issues came out, and they were all over the place, so I couldn't miss them. And I was excited at the time just to be able to buy a first issue of a title.
That's so you had a newsstand distributor who maybe had a close relationship with Martin Goodman or something with that one.
Apparently so.
Now, you guys have mentioned a couple of times Jeanette Kahn, and she's obviously a major figure in your oral history. Do you feel that she, I guess over the years, especially as associated with the DC implosion, has been given a bad rap? I think really the villain in this case has always been kind to it's been more the Warner board that's been given the bad rap in the situation. I think Jeanette and Paul Levitz and everyone were kind of seen as victims in all this. Although I think in our book, again, I think we kind of made that whole situation look a little less, trying to think how I want to describe this, a little less simplistic than I guess it's sometimes described. I think as the story is usually told now is that basically Warner looked at the sales, unaware that there'd been a terrible blizzard the year before that cut sales, that impacted sales, and said, "Hey, we want you to cut back." And as we discovered in researching this book, actually was a little more than that. But that was the detail that caught Warner's attention in May of '78. But in fact, then rather than just say cut the line at that point, then they started looking deeper and saw that there'd been a consistent downward sales trend for the past couple of years. And it had been kind of disguised by the fact that even though the individual titles sold less, DC was publishing more titles to kind of offset the appearance. So it looked like they were still making roughly the same amount of money, but it was actually off of more books rather than less. So the core books weren't selling as well. And that was what they discovered in May of '78. And you did point out, I guess, early in the book that there was, at least at first, a little resistance and perhaps bad blood when in 1976, the then president publisher Carmine Infantino was let go and then Jeanette Kahn was brought in. Do you feel that she fairly quickly, I mean, I get the sense of this from your history, was able to get past some of those bad feelings that maybe some in DC Comics had when she first got there?
I think she found the right allies.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, John.
No, go ahead.
I mean, she found an ally in Paul Levitt. She found an ally in Joe Orlando, who reportedly was one of those who was aghast at the fact that Jeanette Kahn got hired. So I think she managed to align herself with certain executives that had her back, Mike Gold, and she was sort of able to navigate some really troubled waters there.
Because I think there was some resistance because she wasn't coming from a comics background. I mean, her background was in working with magazines, publications like Dynamite and Smash that were for kids or younger readers. So, I mean, it's not that distant, I guess, from the target audience of comics.
No,
right. I mean, and yeah, go ahead, John.
Oh, and Jeanette, certainly, I mean, she wasn't familiar with the comics business per se, but she was familiar with comics as a fan. And even when she was like putting together Dynamite and Smash for Scholastic, she had features on comics in them. So she wasn't coming into the situation cold, but she was coming more as a fan rather than someone who had been in the business like Saul Harrison. And there was definitely some conflict there when she came into the business because Saul was determined to get the president publisher position for himself. And so there was some serious conflict there when all of a sudden here's Jeanette taking the spot he thought was due him.
Yeah.
Now, we should mention that Comic Book Implosion is an oral history, and even though there are substantial sections where the two of you actually do the writing, most of the book is devoted to actual accounts that you guys have culled. I mean, most of it, I think, is past interviews, write-ups, although you do some contemporary interviews as well. But you have a variety of different people within the industry, those on the business side of it, those on publicity, those from creator perspectives, who talk about what was going on at the time. And it's almost as if you have firsthand accounts of what was happening at DC, historically speaking, and you've gathered all that information and have, I think, assembled everything into a whole to where it reads as a really nice narrative. And I think someone reading Comic Book Implosion can get a really good sense of what was going on with DC or the comics industry at the time in a way, I guess in a story-like way, where you do have something almost like a beginning, middle, and end, but you do this largely through excerpting accounts of the time, write-ups, interviews, and I'm just curious. It's a unique approach, this oral history. How did you come up with the idea?
Well, it was. It goes back to, and John, start correcting me if I'm getting the details wrong here, but I remember the genesis of this project is actually rooted in the 1970s volume of American Comic Book Chronicles. And if your listeners are not aware, John and I are integral parts of American Comic Book Chronicles, I can say it right. That which is a decade by decade look at comic book history. And as a side note, as I've told both John Wells and John Morrow, that project is taking years off my life. That's I was a very healthy man when I started that series. Since then, I've had kidney stones, I've had pulmonary embolism, I've had knee surgery. It's my health is falling apart. But not seriously so. But it is an interesting coincidence. Anyway, so as we were working on the 1970s volume, and I had the task of writing the 1978 chapter, and obviously I was doing a lot of research on the DC implosion, and I began to realize, there was all this great material, and the thing about American Comic Book Chronicles that it's a very macro view of comic book history. We only have so many pages that we can devote to any particular topic. And that's why I think like a magazine like Back Issue or even Alter Ego is a great complement to American Comic Book Chronicles, because the articles that you find in Back Issue or Alter Ego very much give a micro view of a particular topic. So as I was writing the section on the DC implosion, I was, remarking to John Wells, like, there's just so much more material here that I think we can make our own book about the event. Because especially, John had written articles about the DC explosion and implosion for Comic Buyer's Guide back in the 80s. Was it a series of articles, John, or was it just one?
It was actually one big article.
Okay.
I think it was planned as a series, but they ended up running everything in one issue.
I realized then it was like, that John and I had access to a lot of material about this topic, and that it would be a fun project for us. That I believe I could easily sell John Morrow on. So that was back in 2014, and John Wells, not John Morrow, John Wells said, well, I got this project I got to finish first, and I got to finish it. And so he kept stalling me, he kept delaying me, and finally we realized that the 40th anniversary of the DC implosion was coming up, and I said to John Wells, I said, listen, it's now or never. And I'm not doing this without you. So we're either doing this together or this book's not coming out. And then I would say magically John Wells found the time to work on this book, and I'm very grateful that he did. And I think the second part of so that's a long-winded answer to your first part of your question, Derek. I think the second part is that, okay, why an oral history? Well, one is that, like you said, we found a lot of interviews about, interviews from, Paul Levitz, Jeanette Kahn, Mike W. Barr, Alex Saviuk, just major and minor figures in this event. And I wanted to see if we could pull off that challenge. To me, it was a challenge, the oral history. Instead of making yet another, prose book like American Comic Book Chronicles is, I wanted to do a different type of format. And like you said, just trying to weave together all of these snippets of interviews and news reports and checklists and things like that is that, can we create an oral narrative from all this to the point where it does read like something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I'm relieved that you feel that we pulled that off.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned checklists. One of the things that I appreciated was that scattered throughout the texts are lists of DC's lineup of titles, and at times things that were canceled. And you start with early 1976, and then you work your way forward during this period of the explosion, implosion, and then the aftermath, I guess up to 1980. And so that gives a more detailed feel to what you have in the oral histories, right? Where people are talking about, in maybe the abstract, things that are canceled. You actually give a list of the things that are canceled, and you give a list of the books that were actually being published and what they were about. So if people don't know that House of Mystery was a collection of horror short stories, you describe that. Same thing with Sergeant Rock and what have you.
We wanted to give readers the sense of just how crippling this event was. And I think it's one thing to say, okay, DC cut 40% of its titles. It's another thing and I think, remember, John, this is like one of the things we agreed to do like really early on. We said, you know what, this is going to work great as a series of checklists. But if you look at how expansive DC's lineup was just, a year before the implosion, and then you see the checklist of what DC's lineup is right after the implosion, and so then visually the readers can see, oh wow, this is a gutted lineup. And I feel I think we felt that was going to be conveyed better with a checklist than just say a paragraph that's listing all the titles which by the way we also include. But and when you look at that post DC implosion lineup, it is practically all Batman and Superman titles. Obviously there's still like the Flash and the Green Lantern, and you have various war and horror titles, but it is such a Superman Batman heavy lineup. And I think we felt that the checklist best conveyed that the impact that the implosion made on the lineup. I don't know if you want to add to that, John.
No, that's basically the one thing that you can really tell looking at that post-crisis or post-implosion lineup is that your experimental stuff, like the fan favorite stuff, is pretty much gone. And there's no Firestorm, there's no All-Star Comics, and all the kind of fringe stuff that kind of attracts fans was just gone.
Yeah, they just relied on their three iconic heroes. They were relying on Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman.
So, and it was basically what they were looking at was basically what at that point sold best on the newsstand. That's kind of how they determined what titles they would keep. And so anything that's selling well in the comic book shops, which, as he said, there weren't many at the time, basically didn't make the cut. So we have, like, for instance, Shade the Changing Man, which was huge in the comic book shops. It did exist, but it wasn't selling well enough to justify keeping it on the newsstands. So it went away.
And, one of the things that I found really ironic is the fact that, okay, so the implosion took place in, I guess, the summer of 78, but within a few months, there was Superman, the movie, the Donner film,
Right.
which was, or at least DC was seeing it in many ways, and you point out in the book, as kind of a saving grace. And so this is like right down the road, but they nonetheless decided, the corporate bigwigs decided to cut quite a number of titles, even with the movie within sight.
Exactly.
I think Mike Tiefenbacher even wrote a very long comment about that, if I remember correctly, John. That in one of his comic reader editorials, he was a bit confused at why they would do this, and like you said there, with the Superman movie just a few months down the road. But I mean, that's obviously, and John said this before. It's so they were looking at those winter sales figures, which were horrendous, but that provoked the Warner executives to then take a wider look and realize, like, oh, wait a minute, this isn't a situation where we've had one bad winter. This is a situation where we're looking at a decade-long downward sales trend, and back then, even it's really the sell-through rates that were probably more important than the actual number of copies sold. And it just, the sell-through rates were dropping, the number of copies sold were dropping, and it's so just we're talking about a glutted comic book marketplace to begin with dealing with newsstand retailers that had a limited amount of space for these comic books. So, I can understand the confusion of okay, well, why not just give it a shot? But at the same time, I think these executives realize, like, wait a minute, this is a systematic problem here that's not going to be solved by a blockbuster Superman movie. It was really, and I think we stressed this in the book, is that the root of the problem is distribution. We try to really drive this home in both the introduction and the conclusion, that the DC implosion is really about the end of the newsstand distribution era. That that everyone realized that something else had to come and replace the newsstand distribution system, or this, the comic book industry was going to just die. I think it was Paul Levitz who told me in one interview that if not for the direct market, if not for the ascension of the direct market, not for the expansion of the direct market, the comic book industry would probably have died in like 83 or 84. And by die, he meant like you're probably looking at, all reprint titles or, things like that.
And even in 1976, when Jeanette Kahn was about to come on board, Bill Sarnoff, the man that hired her, was actually talking about maybe DC going to reprint at that point when she came aboard.
Right.
And basically just because, like, obviously DC had decades worth of material to reprint, and Jeanette's basically reaction was that is a horrible idea, that you need fresh comic books out there every month. Otherwise, your market's going to die. Your fan base is going to die. And so she basically pushed for that going into DC. In fact, even to the point of getting rid of most of DC's reprint books, because she thought it was that important to keep fresh material, fresh content on the stands.
Now, you've mentioned one or two times the winter of 78, and you do point out in Comic Book Implosion that there was a crippling blizzard on the Northeast coast, and that affected comic sales in a variety of different ways, which is interesting. It's something that, living in the South, growing up in North Carolina, and being a kid at the time, I didn't hear about that, or if I did, I didn't pay attention to the news. But I'm wondering,
I lived through it. I grew up on Long Island. I lived through it.
Okay, well, let me ask you guys to speak to this as a at least somewhat determining factor of the sales leading up to the implosion.
Well, a lot of things with the distribution system where trucks could not actually drive out to even deliver product. Planes couldn't fly. I know that was something Jim Shooter talked about at Marvel, that they actually had planes that couldn't even deliver art pages to the Marvel offices because the weather was too bad on the East Coast. And so then you had situations that throughout. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, John. Finish your thought.
Oh, and I'd say even out here in the Midwest, you had situations where the weather was bad enough that some of the comics weren't getting to the distributors to get to the retailers. And so
right, and some comic books weren't even getting to they weren't even getting to the printer.
Right. And so and of course if the weather's bad too, you've got a simple situation. Even if they do make them to the stores, the 7-Elevens, what have you, if the weather's bad enough that kids can't get to the stores to buy the comics.
Right. Right.
And so it was just an accumulation of things that impacted. And I don't recall the weather being as bad as the East Coast here in the Midwest, but I do remember my recollection of the weather being worse in December of '77. But it was just a bad winter in general, where sales were really impacted badly. And this actually wasn't the worst winter or the first winter that this had happened either. My recollection is that the winter of 75 or 75, 76 had been bad too. And I think some of those preliminary sales were one of the things that ultimately got Carmine Infantino fired, and his reaction to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember the blizzard that is discussed in the book, and I remember, we had snow that essentially went up to, now at the time I was 8, so I'm not that tall, but the snow essentially went up to my waist. I went outside to the street and the snow was already, the snow was up to my waist after the storm went through. I'm thinking at 8, like, wow, is this going to happen every winter? Because this is a lot of snow.
Yeah. But one of the things that you guys point out in the afterword, which I guess functions as a conclusion, kind of a wrapping up, is that even if there hadn't been that really bad blizzard in 78, and even if other conditions that you point out in the book hadn't been the case, and you even frame it in terms of, if this were a quantum universe and anything were, every possibility actually did happen, that there would still have been something like the DC implosion coming back to, I guess, the distribution system. And you point out in the afterword, it was the distribution system that was the cause of all this.
We're talking about a newsstand distribution that by the late 70s was completely corrupted because of affidavit returns and publishers not being able to contest the data, the sales data that the distributors were providing them. It's not again. Yeah, I mean, even if Mother Nature cooperated, you're still talking about a corrupted distribution system. And Jim Shooter explained it to me, I think, in a great way, where let's pretend John is Marvel Comics, Derek, you are the distributor, and I am the newsstand dealer. Okay. So John asks you, Derek, okay, I got an issue of Avengers coming out. How many copies do you want? And Derek, you say, okay, I want 1,000 copies. So John gives you 1,000 copies of the latest issue of Avengers. Now, Derek, you really don't care about Avengers because, again, you're making more money on TV Guide and on Sports Illustrated and Time Magazine. So when you send your trucks out to deliver product to me, to the newsstand dealers, you're stuffing it with those magazines, and then, oh wait, you know what? We have enough room left for the comic books. Yeah, go ahead and throw some Avengers in there, and then the Avengers get to me, but 1,000 copies of Avengers don't get to me. I'm maybe getting 600 copies. Okay, so I sell, let's say, of those 600 copies, I sell 300, which is actually a pretty good for newsstand. That's a pretty good sell-through rate. That's a 50% sell-through rate. But it's not 300 copies out of 600. It's 300 copies out of 1,000 that John had sent you. So I tell you, Derek, okay, I sold 300 copies. well, you're not reporting back to John that I sold 300 copies. You're reporting back to John that I sold 250 copies or 200 copies. Because how is John going to, check? Because John is not actually getting back the unsold copies. That's how the newsstand distribution system worked. That you, as a distributor, you're going to get credit for anything that was not sold, as opposed to the direct market retailers where, hey, if you ordered 1,000 copies of Avengers and you didn't sell 1,000 copies of Avengers, well, you're stuck with whatever's unsold. But so now you're telling John, okay, we sold 250 copies out of the 1,000 copies of Avengers. That's a 25% sell-through rate. And now you're taking what's left and you're selling them to, you're selling them through the black market. You're selling them to the recycling center. You're selling them to unscrupulous direct market retailers who are buying it, for pennies an issue and then reselling it then. So that, nicer weather doesn't solve that problem. That was the problem that the newsstand distribution system was by the late 70s. And I think, I'm pretty sure we pointed this out. It wasn't like the newsstand distributors were picking on the comic book companies. They were doing this to everybody. They were doing it to Playboy, to Time Magazine. They skewed the numbers in their favor with everybody. And but here's the advantage that TV Guide and Sports Illustrated have over comic books. They were getting significantly more advertising revenue than comic books. Comic books were only going to make so much money, with these Sea Monkey ads and these Toy Soldier ads. They're not, the advertising. And Jim Shooter flat out said to me, he's like, Playboy, Hugh Hefner would have been giving copies away of Playboy. That's how much money he was making off of advertising from Playboy. He didn't even need the money that he was getting from the sales of the copies. Which when you think about it, like if you remember like these TV ads and how, like Sports Illustrated, they would sell it at like 80% off if you subscribe, because that's how much money they were making off of the ads, that they could practically give their magazines away. But comic books, they were not in that situation. They were not making money off of advertising. So that is really the root cause of I think a lot of the problems the comic book industry was facing in the 1970s. And I'll also say this, you know what? I'm sorry, if I can just add one more
Sure.
anecdote to that. And John, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was having lunch with a colleague, and she was asking about, and she's not a comic book reader at all, and she was asking about, okay, well, what's the book about? So I started explaining, about the DC explosion and implosion, and I got to everything that I just told you guys. And as I was just starting my explanation, she stopped me and said, "Oh yeah, so then the distributors just skewed the numbers." And I was like, "Yeah, how did you know that?" She goes, "My dad sold milk. He did that all the time." So it wasn't even,
Wow.
he was a milk salesman, and she said that, like one of his clients was like McDonald's, and he had to sell. He would say he sold them 10 cases, but he really only gave them 8 cases, because then with the extra 2 cases, he took the extra 2 cases of milk and sold it to, the local deli, and that was money in his pocket. And she's like, "Oh yeah, that's not that's not just a newsstand distribution thing. That's just that's prevalent everywhere." So she was well familiar with what was going on.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you, we describe this as an oral history where you guys obviously had to do quite a bit of research in pulling everything together and then organizing it in a kind of whole that reads like a cohesive narrative. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in doing the research for this book?
It was just a matter of gathering all of the fanzines. I had a complete run of the Comic Reader, which we referenced a lot, and then we had to track down the Comics Journal, which was fairly easy. Then toward the end of the project, we started looking for more obscure sources, like the Comics Buyer's Guide, which was just the buyer's guide for comic fandom in the 70s. That was like a weekly newspaper. Those are very hard to come by. And so we ultimately went to a fan named Russ Maharis that actually has a complete run of the buyer's guide from the 70s. And so he actually made scans for us of articles related to the implosion. And that's actually where we got some of the photos in the book from, too. And then there was a magazine really more about pop culture by that point called Media Scene that was published by Jim Steranko. And that was another late addition to this process that I found a lot of issues from the 1976-78 period. And it had some really comprehensive material.
Yeah, that was a gold mine. Yeah, Media Scene was a gold mine.
One of the things they published was a long interview with Mike Gold that following the implosion that had details that absolutely no one else reported. And so that was a very satisfying experience, but just accumulating all that. And there was also a magazine published in the UK called Comic Media News, and they actually conducted interviews with Jeanette Kahn, Paul Levitz, Mike Gold during the 70s, kind of prior to the explosion, and that was also a gold mine of material. So we actually, once we gathered all this material, we had an enormous amount of material that was actually contemporary. And to my mind, probably better than asking people to try to reconstruct their memories 40 years after the fact.
Oh, I was just going to say, and then there were times when, like, we would have these excerpts, say, from, like, a Mike Gold interview, and we were trying to figure out how to break it up, or like a Mike Tiefenbacher commentary. And we're like, we got to figure out a way to break this up a little bit because like the passage was too long. So going back to what you were saying, Derek, earlier about always keeping in mind this is an oral narrative. We're not just vomiting interview quotations at the reader. We're trying to shape this into there's got to be a flow to this narrative. And so then I'm pretty sure it was you, John, that said, I can insert some editorial comments here that provide context to a lot of these quotations, which were extremely valuable.
Yep, that was what I think made this work, was a lot of the bridging material between the quotes. It kind of puts everything in a little more context.
Yeah. And the way that, and what you're mentioning now, I think, is the way that you've organized all of these excerpts, because you get the actual text from the more times than not the contemporary source, right? So someone or some outlet that's reporting, but then you have bracketed your own comments that set a context and in many ways build up or lead up to the next excerpt that we have. And so I think that those are, that's so to speak, the mortar that kind of puts all these bricks together.
I like that metaphor.
Now, you said that you had a wealth of material. Did you feel that there were things that you could have included in this book, but you just didn't because you were overwhelmed with the finds that you made?
John found a great Marty Pascal, that Marty Pascal quote about Ross Andrew, John, that you found.
That was actually, once we put the book, there's still things in the book that I wish were in there. But yeah, after we put the book to bed and we had it off to the printer, we had found a great quote from Marty Pascal. And it just kills me that it's not in the book. But basically, one of the things I discovered while researching this was that Marty was actually supposed to follow Steve Englehart on Justice League of America at the end of 1977. And instead, DC wanted Marty to launched DC Comics Presents, which was coming in the spring of 78, and the world's greatest superheroes comic strip, which was also coming in 1978. And because of those commitments, he couldn't do Justice League. So they handed it to Jerry Conway, who did a series of stories that kind of led up to the wedding of the Atom. And one of the things that I discovered in the course of, or after the fact here, after we'd sent the book to bed, was that actually Marty was offered Justice League again when Ross Andrew took over the book, which would have been first issue published in August of '78. And he was actually going to do the book until Ross told him that the first story he wanted to do was like a first contact story where the Justice League meets aliens from outer space for the first time. And Marty was kind of slack-jawed when this was presented to him, because he said, this is a group that includes Superman, Hawkman, characters who are already from outer space, ignoring all the other characters from outer space. And Marty basically said, I can't do this. And so he excused himself from the project, and Jerry continued to write Justice League of America.
Right.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because whereas obviously the core of this book is the DC explosion and then the resulting implosion and then the aftermath, there's a lot of detail in here about who wrote what, and sometimes some inside politicking that was going on, and others who may have, let's say, been a little upset because they didn't get to write or illustrate something. So, you know, those who are interested in comics history, I mean, yeah, they can find out quite a bit about the DC implosion from this book, but at the same time, they can also get a lot of information of who was doing what, or who could have, or who wanted to do what. And not just at DC, but also at Marvel, because there's quite a bit in this book that's devoted to what's going on at Marvel at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite quotes is that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
That was another revelation that we found fairly late in the game, was the fact that DC almost hired John Buscema very early, stole him from Marvel.
Right.
That was actually going to be like their first big catch of Jeanette Kahn's administration, because there was a blow up at Marvel over credits on a book that he and Stan Lee were putting together, and they managed to luckily mend fences there. But John was ready to work for DC. He was going to draw Superman. He was going to do a new Barbarian book, and luckily they nipped that in the bud before it happened. Or I say luckily for Marvel,
right.
But that's the sort of thing that we were able to dig up in some cases.
I love that long Len Wein quote regarding who was it who recruited? Was it Paul? Was it Paul Levitz who recruited him to DC? I believe so.
Let's see. Yes.
It was so Paul Levitz recruited him to DC because obviously he was at the time one of Marvel's main writers, and Len wanted to reunite with Julius Schwartz on Detective once Steve Englehart had finished his run. And Stan Lee got wind and said, okay, wait a minute. He wasn't leaving Marvel. He was going to be doing both, writing for Marvel and writing for DC. And Stan's like, we can't have that. We can't have, essentially our main writer, not exclusive to Marvel. So why don't we do this? Why don't you write Detective Comics under a pseudonym? And I guess Len at that time was very compliant, because he said, "Okay, Stan." So he reported back to Paul Levitz and said, "Okay, I still want to do Detective, but Stan's telling me to do it under a pseudonym." And Paul, understanding, was like, "Wait a minute, we need Len. We need to promote this as a Len Wein book. We can't have this as, so finally Len said he really went through some real, sort of emotional agonizing over this, because obviously he didn't want to betray Stan Lee, but he felt he had sort of gone down this road and made this decision and really wanted to write Detective. And then he just said, he reported to Archie Goodwin and said, "I'm sorry, but I have to basically jump ship and go with DC now." So, and that's a very long quote, but it's a very satisfying quote, because you really feel the emotional turmoil that Len was feeling at the time.
Mm. Now, again, the vast majority of the material that you're pulling from for the various quotes in oral histories are either temporary to the time, or just a few years later, right? Like in the early 80s, people are recounting this. So for all practical purposes, it's of the time period. However, you do have quite a number of entries that, I guess, interviews that you guys conducted this year with current creators who maybe were kids at the time. I'm thinking in particular of Kurt Busiek, Mark Waid, and Phil Jimenez. And so I'm curious how you chose the authors who are younger, who weren't a part of DC at the time, but who experienced it from a reader's point of view, a fan's point of view.
Well, we had to obviously go with people who the reader would recognize. I mean, the reader's obviously going to recognize who Mark Waid is going to recognize who Tom Brevoort is. So, and also, help me out, John. I mean, we also needed people that we knew were going to have some vivid memories of, I mean, Tom Brevoort has written about, Tom Brevoort, I think, does a daily almost retrospective of his childhood, comic book purchases, where he'll say, okay, and this month back in 1976, I remember getting this comic book. So, I mean, so with Tom, we knew that was someone, and John and I are friendly with Tom, so we knew that what he would provide us would be entertaining and illuminating. Same thing with Mark, same thing with Phil Jimenez. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I was going to say, in Mark's case, I've known him since the 80s, and so we've actually talked about Canceled Comic Cavalcade before. And so, in fact, the very last quote in the book, before the book ends, which I won't spoil it here, but basically, Mark told me the story back by circa 1989 about the story about how he finally had laid eyes on Canceled Comic Cavalcade, and what his experience or what his reaction was when he finally got to read it after dreaming of it for so many years. And it's a funny story, and like I said, I won't spoil the story since it is literally at the end of the book. But I told him specifically, I said, you have to retell that story for the book. So.
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember, John, how we. I'm acquainted with Michael T. Gilbert, but I'm trying to remember if it was something that you suggested I reach out to him, or because
I do.
What he says is really a wonderful counterpoint.
Yes,
oh, okay.
Yes. But I do recall that we were trying to get people that are about the right age, and we were also thinking of someone. In Michael's case, it's actually affiliated with TwoMorrows, so because he works with Roy Thomas on Alter Ego, so he was easily accessible. So.
Yeah, but I think I just sort of randomly reached out to him, and then what he provided me with was like, oh, this is because it's such a great. I mean, spoiler alert: Michael was not fond of 1970s era DC Comics once Jeanette took over. So I'm like, this is great. This is perfect because we sort of, we have so many of these quotations that are waxing poetic about, once Jeanette took over, and to get that type of counterpoint was important, I think, to us, that to say, and again, Derek, this is, I think, one of the advantages of an oral history is that you can include perspectives that contradict or oppose the viewpoint, the prevalent viewpoints, and it fits in because it's just you just add another voice you've added another voice to the narrative.
Now, you mentioned a second ago Canceled Comics Cavalcade. For those who don't know what that is, describe that.
Basically, once the decision had come down to cancel all these titles, DC was sitting on a whole bunch of stats for comic books that were basically ready to go to the printer. They were, some of them might have needed a little bit of minor editing, but they were ready to go. And so, partly just to maintain their copyright on the material, partly just kind of create a premium for the people that worked on them, DC decided to actually publish those in-house, photocopied. So they brought all these reams of paper down to their photocopying department and had, I think they called him Neil with the Magic Finger. That was kind of a joke in the cover page, and had him photocopy 40 sets. And they had a special cover drawn up for each issue, which they called Canceled Comic Cavalcade. One by Al Milgrom, one by Alex Saviuk. printed these up, bound them, and then handed most of the copies to the creators that worked on them. So, like, for instance, Jerry Conway had written several books or stories in the book that weren't published, Bob Rozakis, and they gave those copies to the creators that were in the book. They gave a copy to Bob Overstreet that published the Overstreet Price Guide so that he'd have proof that these actually existed. And I think, as Mike Gold say, I think they even actually sent a couple over state lines just so that there was a distribution part to this. But basically, it was partly to maintain copyright, as I say, and partly just a special premium. And so basically, even to this day, a lot of those stories have never been published. Some of them they actually got into print later, like there was a Black Lightning story intended for Black Lightning number 12 that they eventually worked into an issue of World's Finest in 1979. Some stories like the last two issues of Commandy were only published like last year in 2017 in an issue of Commandy Challenge Special. The first issue of the Vixen, and the Vixen's a fairly prominent character now, still hasn't been published to this date. Jerry Conway finally used the character in, I think, the end of 1981 in Action Comics, but the actual origin story of the character has never been published to this date. Secret Society of Supervillains, the last two issues, one of them was only penciled, and it wasn't even inked. Those were finally published in a 2007 hardback. But so anyway, so this has been kind of a holy grail for years. The fans wanting to see what's in those two titles, and there was also some complete dreck in there too. Al Milgram had found some issues of the Green Team, which was a Joe Simon creation. Prez, Teenage President, the last issue of that was never published, and so they had these laying around. So even though they weren't intended for the DC explosion, they said, "Oh, let's throw those in too." So they did.
And for some, for instance, Mark Waid, this became almost like a holy grail, right? To try to find and actually read Canceled Comics Cavalcade. Mm-hmm. So, with Waid, Busick, Jimenez, and others, you had contemporary takes of what the readers' fans were experiencing at the time, with limited knowledge, really, about what was going on.
Right.
At the same time, you balance that with an abundance material of people who had that inside knowledge. Now, I'm curious, both of you growing up during this time as readers of comics, what were your personal experiences of what was going on at DC in 77, 78, and 79?
John, this is mostly going to be you because I was 8 at the time, so it's Go ahead. I'm more interested in what in your experience.
Well, I was pretty much like say I of course I've read comics as long as I could read, so I was reading Disney starting in '69, and I moved over to DC in 1974. But even then, I wasn't reading even close to the entire DC line. My allowance only went so far, and even then, like say, as the comics went from 30 cents to 35 cents, then I could only afford so much. So, but even so, I was kind of excited about the DC explosion. To begin with, I had no idea that the price was going up because I had no access to fanzines. So all I knew is that DC was advertising they're going to add all these new features. And I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. And then I start thinking, what's going to happen to the price? And so finally in May of 78, then I saw the solicitations for the DC explosions that actually listed the price. I thought, oh, this is going to be a problem. So I ended up actually during the DC explosion DC explosion having to drop some books because there was only so much I could afford at the 50-cent price. So it was actually almost, as terrible as this sounds to say now, it was actually almost a relief to me that when they actually dropped to 40 cents in September, but I had no idea what was going on. All I knew was that one day DC's comics had been 50 cents, the next day they were 40. And so it was probably a couple of years before I really discovered what had happened, because without access to fanzines, I had no clue. But the impact of the DC explosion on me was that I actually started experimenting with Marvels, because Marvels were still selling for 35 cents in the summer of 78. And I'd been reading, for instance, the Amazing Spider-Man comic strip in the newspaper, so I thought, well, this is a good time to start trying that. So I actually started branching out to Marvel because of the DC explosion, because they were cheaper. So that's a terrible thing for a DC fan to say, but that's the truth. That's what happened.
Right.
So anyway, but then as time went by, then like I say, I was still like a hardcore DC fan at my core, and so I became more fascinated as I started hearing the story about DC implosion and everything in the later years, and so then it became kind of an obsession with me to gather all the material on this subject and to get all the comics and to find out where all the comic stories that weren't published went. And so that was kind of what led me to write this Comics Buyer's Guide article that Keith talked about.
Which served in many ways as part of the genesis of this project.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
John just didn't know it back in the 80s that he was already starting to work on this book.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, you guys mentioned a little while ago the American Comic Book Chronicles series, and we should mention that, I know, Keith, you're a big part of this series, obviously, but the two of you did work together on the two 1960s volumes, correct?
We work together essentially on every volume, Derek, is really what it comes down to. John is one of our principal, John, I am, the editor-in-chief, but I make sure to send every chapter, regardless of decade, to John for his feedback, for his, because he and I have, very complementary skill sets and in terms of, like comic book knowledge, things like that. So John, even if John's name is not in a particular volume, although I'm pretty sure, John, that at least in the acknowledgement section, you've been thanked.
Yes,
I think.
Yep.
I would hope.
Originally,
so.
when like I say, this whole project was actually initiated by Keith, but actually way back when you first offered me a chance to write one of the books, I wanted the 70s because that was my generation, and the 70s was already spoken for. So I ended up having to take the 60s, and the 60s ended up then, at John Morrow's request, ended up turning into 2 volumes. So I ended up getting quite an assignment out of that. So my 2 official volumes are the 60s, 60 to 64 and 65 to 69. But then as the 70s rolled along, then I did get to add a lot of input into it. But anyway, but this new comic book implosion volume has been kind of like a dream come true to me to actually focus on the 70s, something that I didn't officially get to do on the American Comic Book Chronicles volume.
Right. There are many passages in the 1970s volume that were written by John. As we sent him chapters and he would say, I took the liberty of expanding this passage, and then I would look at it and, here's, 6 or 7 more paragraphs. And I'm like, oh, okay, very good. So that's, it's the 1970s volume has many hands involved in it, but and hopefully a consistent voice or writing style, I would hope.
Yeah. And we can mention that the next volume in the American Comic Book Chronicles covering the 1990s will be coming out this fall.
Yes. Yep. With Jason Sachs.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And hopefully, we spent a lot of time on that. We, it's as you go on with these volumes, you become more and more self-critical because you have now, you have a standard that you have to live up to. So you got to make sure that all the new volumes are aligned with, what John wrote in the 1960s volume, what Jason wrote in the 1970s volume, what Bill wrote in the 1950s volume. That you got to make sure it conforms to the standard. Like, you can't have not to say that Jason was some madman who was but just to say, okay, let's keep in mind that this is the format, and let's make sure. So it was a book that took us a long time to put together, and that's really I'm going to take the blame for that. So a lot of it is I did mention my health problems, right? I did mention that. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So you guys have this new book, Comic Book Implosion, that came out just last month. You're both working on the American Comic Book Chronicles series. You both work with TwoMorrows magazines, their various publications. Is there another project that each of you may be working on right now that you can share with us?
What are you working on now, John? I don't even know what you're working on.
I actually am just finished with an article. It's not a big project, but an article for back issue on imaginary stories of the Bronze Age at DC. And I've got an article in, which I believe it'll be in shops this week, in the current issue of back issue, which is like devoted to the Golden Age and the Bronze Age, on Airwave. But those are the only projects I've got on the agenda, and those are both complete.
I'm now working with Kurt Mitchell on the 1940s volume, and he's just finishing the first volume. Like with the 60s volume, John Morrow has decided to break up the 1940s into 2 volumes. So Kurt is wrapping up the final chapter of the first volume. He's finishing the 1944 chapter, and he has done an incredible job. I wouldn't even know how to begin writing a volume on a 1940s comic book, but the stuff that the research that Kurt has done on this volume is exemplary, and I'm really eager to see the reader reaction to what he's produced, because I think it's really phenomenal. That should be out sometime early next year.
And I can just reiterate what Keith said. That Kurt has done a spectacular job on the first half of the 40s volume. I've learned a lot reading it, so it is beautifully done, and the research is just impeccable.
Yeah, something else to look forward to, but more immediately, your new book, Comic Book Implosion, An Oral History of DC Comics, circa 1978, came out not even 2 weeks ago, and I strongly recommend that listeners, whether you're interested in DC history or not, if you're a comics fan, this is definitely a book for you. So I want to thank both of you, John and Keith, for coming on the Comics Alternative. It's been a really fun time.
Thank you very much for having us.
I want to thank Keith Dallas and John Wales once again for coming on the Comics Alternative to discuss Comic Book Implosion. If you're a student of comic book history, if you're a fan of DC Comics, or you just want to know more about the twists and turns within the industry, this book is definitely for you. And if you want to find great critical books like Comic Book Implosion, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find unbeatable prices on a variety of single issues, graphic novels, archival collections, and scholarly and critical texts. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Keith and John, the first episode in our Critical Take series. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly at derek@comicsalternative.com. And we're all over social media. Check out our sites on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. So this wraps up the very first episode in our new Critical Take series, and we have more Critical Takes episodes lined up in the months to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.